Hi Year 5, we're going on to some very seasonal snow in Chapter 6, although the weather is a little bit dodgy, so I don't think we're going to get snow. Dinah sat up in bed for a long time that night, a stiff little figure in a white nightdress hugging her knees. She knew that there was something wrong about the school, with its well-behaved children all doing the right thing at the right moment, but she couldn't understand what it was, and she knew that she did not like the headmaster at all. She could not understand why she kept saying how wonderful he was. She hated not understanding things. In the end, she did what she always did when things baffled her. Slipping quietly out of bed, she pulled back the curtains so that the room was lit by moonlight from outside. Then she went to stand in front of the mirror, pale and prim. Her reflection stared back at her. The eyes thoughtful and the mouth pursed up, considering. Well, she murmured, what's wrong? Why is the school so peculiar? Gazing into her own eyes, she suddenly knew the answer. Fear. It's because they're all afraid. She nodded briskly. Yeah, that was the right answer. But what are they afraid of? The reflection stared back, unwinking, and she heard the reply in her head. That's what you'll have to find out. How? But she hardly needed to ask. The answer to that one was obvious. You'll have to be naughty and see what happens to you. Her hands clasped on top of the dressing table began to shake slightly, but the face that looked back at her out of the mirror was amused. See, you're afraid yourself. You don't even know why. Defiantly, she stuck her chin up and pulled her face into the mirror. I don't care if I'm scared, she said out loud. I want to know, and if that's the only way to find out, that's what I'll do. With a determined hand, she closed the curtains and climbed back into bed, feeling as though she'd settled something. Curling up under the covers, she fell asleep, trying to think of something bad she could do. When the morning came, she was still considering. She didn't expect Lloyd and Harvey to speak to her after their quarrel the day before, and she came down to breakfast in a proud silence and not saying anything even to Mrs. Hunter. But things were a bit different. Something had happened that she'd not counted on. It had finally snowed. Outside in the garden, a white unbroken sheet stretched across the grass, gleaming in the crisp, clear light, and Harvey was so excited that he'd forgotten about everything else. He wriggled delightfully in his chair. Oh, I wish we didn't have to go to school today, don't you, Di? Sky blue sandwiches, snorted Lloyd, his mouth full of porridge. Do you ever want to go to school? No, but it's different today, Harvey said earnestly. If we stayed at home, we could build a snowman and have a snowball fight and... Oh, Mum, couldn't we? Don't be silly, dear, Mrs. Hunter said placidly. There's no point in asking questions like that. Just make sure you wrap up warmly. You know the cold's bad for your chest. She hovered over them while they dressed, insisting on bundling Harvey up in extra scarves and gloves until he looked like a little round parcel. And all the time he was hopping up and down, peering longingly out of the window at the snow. When she finally let them go, Harvey ran joyfully outside and kicked his boots about, scattering a fine dust of snow. Oh, it's beautiful, it's lovely. Don't you think it's gorgeous, Di? Yes, I like snow, she said dreamily. We used to have terrific snowball fights at the children's home, the sort where you pick the sides and build up great stocks of snowballs before you start. Oh, fantastic. Harvey reached down for a handful of snow. Come on, Lloyd said crossly. We'll be late for school. Harvey's face dropped. Still deep in her own thoughts, Dinah said, We could always have a snowball fight in the playground at morning playtime. She was so busy thinking of her own plans for the day that she didn't notice how Harvey brightened and started to whistle. All she could think of was that she had found a good way to be naughty. She was so busy thinking, in fact, that she walked into school and into her classroom in a daze. It was not until she was sitting at her desk that she realised that she'd automatically moved into line and marched in with the others, as if she'd been told what to do, but she didn't remember anyone having told her. Before she had time to work that one out, however, she had another surprise. Mr. Venables, the class teacher, was giving out pieces of paper. This morning, he said as he moved around the room, I want you to write down everything you know about the solar system. As it happened, Dinah knew a great deal about the solar system, but she had no intention of writing it all down. That would just be asking for trouble. She settled down to consider what she could safely say, but before she thought about it at all, she found herself writing in strange, stiff little sentences. The planets of the solar system are Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus and Neptune. The Sun is a star of the solar system. The distance from the Earth to the Sun is 1 astronomical unit. The radius of the Sun is 695,700 kilometres. She stopped with an effort and stared at the last sentence she'd written. But I didn't know that, she thought. She never remembered seeing that particular piece of information before, yet there it was, confidently written down on a piece of paper as though someone had slipped it into her head without her knowing. Cautiously, she leant sideways to glance at the paper on the desk next to her. The boy beside her had just written, "The radius of the sun is 695,700 kilometres." Although the classroom was warm, she found herself shivering. Everyone in the room was scribbling busily, and she was suddenly sure that they'd all just written, "The radius of the sun is 695,700 kilometres." 30 little robots all obediently writing down the same things that had been put into their heads for them. The only person who was not writing was Lloyd. He was chewing the end of his pencil as if he didn't know very much about the solar system. Dinah let herself feel a little quiver of mean pleasure that he was in trouble. Then she started to write again, and the information went on pouring out. Most of it she knew, but every now and again came a little bit that she didn't. And as she wrote, she pursed her lips together determinedly. Things were getting weirder and weirder, and she should find out why. She would. At playtime, she put on her hat and coat and marched out into the playground, ready to carry out her plan. Without speaking to anyone, she knelt down and began to make a heap of snowballs, intending to throw them when she had a pile of 10. But she reckoned without Harvey. When she was only halfway through, he came bounding across to her, past all the groups of children chanting tables and dates. "Ah, Di, you remembered." "What?" She looked up vaguely. "You remembered. We really are going to have our first snowball fight." Suddenly she realised what she'd done. "No, Harvey, I didn't mean you. Don't be a spoil sport." He bent down and picked up 2 of the snowballs she had made. Almost at once Lloyd was there. He came bounding across the playground at top speed. "H, what are you doing?" "We're going to have a snowball fight," Harvey said cheerfully. "It's Di's idea." "Don't be an idiot." Lloyd knocked the snowballs out of his hand. "Let her get into trouble if she wants to, but you don't have to get mixed up with it." "That's right," Dinah said. She didn't realise how odd it sounded until she saw Lloyd staring at her. She stared back defiantly, and while the 2 of them were distracted, Harvey stooped down and picked up 2 more snowballs. "I think you're both horrible," he shouted, "and I will have a snowball fight. The snow might be all gone by tomorrow." His yell sounded eerily loud among the mutters in the playground. As he drew his right arm back to throw, Lloyd shouted warningly, "H, no!" And from the other side of the playground came the sound of Ian's voice calling, "Watch out, you lot!" But it was too late. As total silence fell over the playground, the 2 snowballs flew from Harvey's gloved hands and spattered messily, one on Lloyd's coat and one on Dinah's. "Lloyd and Harvey Hunter, Dinah Glass, come here," bellowed a voice from the steps. Ranged on the steps, the prefects were staring at them, a row of 6 stern faces. Slowly, Lloyd, Harvey and Dinah walked to the foot of the steps and stood looking up. "Wait there," Rose said curtly. "We'll deal with you when the others have gone inside." Dear. Chapter 7. The Punishment. As Rose began to call out orders, the neat rows of children formed and filed into the building. Lloyd, Harvey and Dinah stood awkwardly, not looking at each other, until the whole playground was empty and they were alone gazing up at the prefects, who stood like a row of iron statues. Jeff stared down at them and chanted, "It is forbidden to waste time by playing in the playground." "It is forbidden," Rose went on, "to make a mess of your school uniform." "You must be punished," Sarah said. "In a suitable manner," finished off Simon, smiling slightly. Drawing together, the prefects whispered for a moment, and then Rose turned to them again. "Go inside," she rapped out. "Take off your hats and coats and gloves, then come back here." As they walked towards the cloakroom, Dinah whispered to Lloyd, "What's going to happen? What will they do?" "I don't know," he said sourly, "but whatever it is, it'll be all your fault. I wish you'd never come." "No, it's my fault," Harvey said in a miserable voice. "I threw the snowballs, and whatever they do, it'll be terrible." When they came out of the door again, 4 of the prefects had gone. Rose was standing looking out over the playground with a pleased smile on her face, and Jeff was by her side holding 3 long-handled brooms. "Now," she said in a silky voice, "you're very lucky. We've decided to be kind to you." Lloyd and Harvey looked uneasily at each other. "Yes," Rose's smile broadened, "because you're so fond of playing with the snow, we're going to let you have some more time with it." Jeff held out the brooms. "You will each take one of these, and you will sweep up all the snow from the playground into a heap. Then," he looked at Rose with a grin, "you will make a whole heap into snowballs. For a second, Harvey looked perplexed, but Lloyd burst out. Aren't you going to let us put our coats on and things? Rose went on smiling. Certainly not. But you can't do that. Harvey's got a weak chest. He could be ill. Silence. Suppose we say no. Excuse me, asked Dinah in a stiff voice. Rose and Jeff looked at her as if she had said something unbelievably stupid. Together they chanted, "The prefects are the voice of the headmaster. They must be obeyed." Then Jeff thrust the brooms at them. "Get sweeping." Resigned, Lloyd and Harvey trailed off down the steps, dragging their brooms after them. Dinah lingered rebelliously for a second or two, then joined them at the far end of the playground. "Let's do it as quickly as we can," she said. "Perhaps that'll keep us warm." "Huh," Lloyd snorted. "Don't know why you're so cheerful. None of this would have happened if you hadn't started talking about snowball fights." He banged his broom crossly into the snow and began to sweep, pushing it into a great white mound in front of him. For the first 10 minutes or so, it wasn't too bad. The exercise kept them fairly warm, but then the wind started to blow, scattering the snow as they swept it and freezing their fingers. "I'm so cold," Harvey said plaintively, "and we're only halfway across. We're never going to get it all swept." "Don't give up yet," Lloyd said grimly. "This is the easy part. Just wait until we've got to start on those snowballs." Dinah shuddered at that thought as the wind whipped around her thin school shirt. Then she found that she couldn't stop shivering. Her whole body was shaking and her teeth were clattering together uncontrollably. She put down her broom for a moment to clap her arms around herself for a bit of warmth. Instantly, from the building behind them, came an irate tapping. Turning, she saw Rose gesturing furiously at her through the window. She picked up the broom again and began to sweep harder, trying to ignore the shaking. At last the snow was piled into a single heap, almost as tall as Harvey. The three of them laid their brooms down at one side. Hans stared at it. "I don't think I can do it," Harvey said woefully. "My hands are hurting." Lloyd watched him anxiously. His face had a bluish tinge and he was starting to breathe wheezily. "Why don't you stop?" Dinah said. "Tell them you won't do it. I don't suppose the headmaster would really be angry. He must see." Then her teeth rattled together so hard that she couldn't go on speaking. Lloyd and Harvey said nothing, just looked at her as though she was completely idiotic and bent down to start making snowballs. "Oh, all right," she said crossly. "Be like that. I bet I can make snowballs faster than you." As soon as she touched the snow, she knew that it was going to be a nightmare. Her hands were already painfully cold, but at least they'd been dry up to now. The snow made them wet, and the cold wind whipping across stung them so that they felt almost as if they were burning. Anxiously, she wondered how long it would be before she got frostbite and her fingers started to turn black and drop off. It would not have been quite so bad if Lloyd and Harvey had been sympathetic, but neither of them spoke to her. Lloyd was making snowballs in a frenzy, trying to get through the huge heap as quickly as possible. If he looked at her at all, it was only to pull a disgusted face. And Harvey had started to cry. Without stopping work, he was sobbing with pain, his face growing red and raw now as the wind scoured his tears from his round cheeks. "I can't," murmured a voice in Dinah's head. I can't. But all the time, mechanically, she went on making snowballs, until it seemed that she would never stop, as if she would go on until the end of the world, stooping, seizing a handful of snow, squashing it together in her agonised hands, and dropping it onto the pile. They seemed to have been there for about 100 years, when Lloyd said suddenly, 2 or 3 more each and we're finished." Glancing sideways at his watch, Dinah saw that it wasn't yet 12 o'clock. Gritting her teeth, she scrunched together the last couple of handfuls of snow and flung them triumphantly onto the top of the pile. "That's it, we've finished. Let's go inside and get warm." "Not yet," Lloyd said bitterly. "Look, they're coming to inspect us." Sure enough, the prefects, all 6 of them, were trooping down the steps from the school, marching in perfect time. They walked across the playground and stood in a half circle around Lloyd, Harvey and Dinah. "Not a very tidy heap of snowballs," Rose said grudgingly. She looked sideways at Jeff and his spotty face suddenly creased into a leering smile. "But you must have enjoyed yourselves," he said softly, "since you're so fond of snow. Do you think they've had enough snow yet, Rose?" She leered back at him. "Surely not when they like it so much." Without warning, the line of prefects surged forwards in unison, their hands outstretched. Lloyd, Harvey and Dinah were each seized by 2 prefects who spun them round and knocked them forwards, face down, into the snow. As Dinah's face crashed down into the hard, bald snow, her first feeling was one of despair. Snow slammed up her nose, into her eyes, and all down her front, soaking her clothes. It seemed like the last straw. and she nearly burst into tears. But by the time she stood up, she was furious. Furious and incredulous, leaping to her feet, she began to yell at the prefects. "That's too much. You can't do that. I shall go and tell the headmaster. He'll punish you. You've got no right to treat us like that." Very softly, Jeff started to laugh, and Rose, shaking with merriment, pointed a finger towards the school, where the window of the headmaster's office faced them. At the window was a pale face, its eyes hidden behind dark glasses. It stared out over the playground, apparently without expression. "So he knows, does he?" Dinah said quietly, her mouth set stubbornly. "Well, I'm not scared of him, even if the rest of you are. I shall go and tell him just what I think of him for letting something like this happen to a boy as little as Harvey." Her feet sounding loud on the cleared tarmac, she stamped across the playground and into the school, carried along by the force of her cold rage. Without stopping to consider what she was doing, she marched up to the door of the headmaster's office and hammered on it with both fists. Nothing happened. Crossly she caught at the handle and rattled it, but the door was locked and so heavy that it hardly moved. "I know you're in there," she shouted. "I saw you at the window and I think it's disgusting. Fancy letting the prefects bully a little boy like Harvey. It might make him ill. You're inhuman." She paused. No sound came from behind the door, and for a second she felt completely helpless. Then, at last, her brain began to work. She smiled triumphantly and went on speaking in a quieter voice. "Anyway, you won't get away with this. Even headmasters aren't allowed to do things like that. When we get home, we'll all tell Mr. and Mrs. Hunter, and there'll be a scandal. You'll be prosecuted." There was still no sound, but she didn't care now that she'd worked out what to do next. Her fingers were starting to hurt as the warmth of the building reached them, so with a final thump on the door, she began to run down the corridor towards the classrooms. If only she could wash them in warm water, she would feel better, and if there was something hot for lunch, even Harvey might be all right. She was making so much noise that she didn't hear the office door open behind her. She didn't look over her shoulder and see the pale face which stared after her. If she had, she would have been puzzled, because the face was smiling. "So, Miss Clever Glass," murmured the headmaster, "you've got a soft spot for Harvey Hunter, have you? You're ready to protect him? Well, that might come in useful. Yes, indeed. I must think about that." His smile broadened. "After this afternoon's assembly." And he turned away. He laughed softly and evilly. Lloyd burst in through the back door of the kitchen, 100 yards ahead of Harvey and Dinah. Mum, where are you?" Mrs. Hunter emerged from the hall. "Goodness me, what a fuss. The end of the world, at least, I should think. Whatever is the matter?" "It's what happened at school today." Lloyd slumped down in a chair. "It was simply terrible." Mrs. Hunter suddenly stopped, looking sympathetic. "Now, Lloyd, I hope this isn't going to be another one of your silly stories. You know what trouble we've had in the past with your lies." "It's different this time," Lloyd said triumphantly. "Dinah will tell you that it's true, and you'll believe her, won't you?" He turned round and waved a hand at Harvey and Dinah, who were coming through the door. "Well, Dinah certainly looks calmer than you do," Mrs. Hunter said. "But she knows too," Lloyd yelled. "She'll tell you." "Don't shout, dear." "Oh, why don't you ask her?" "Yes," said Harvey excitedly. "Ask Dinah what happened at school today." "You'll believe her," Lloyd said bitterly. Dinah was frowning, looking at the three of them in bewilderment. "Well, dear," Mrs. Hunter said gently, "tell me, what happened at school today?" In a perfectly calm, even voice, Dinah said, "At school this morning, Harvey made snowballs, and we all had a snowball fight. It was super. The headmaster made sure we all dressed up warmly in our hats and coats and gloves, and he gave us drinks of hot blackcurrant when we came inside." "What?" Lloyd stared at her. Harvey looked appalled. "Dinah!" Mrs. Hunter smiled comfortably. "It all sounds very nice." "But you don't understand," Lloyd exploded. "It's not true. It wasn't like that at all. Be quiet." All at once, Mrs. Hunter was very angry. "It's always the same, Lloyd. You and Harvey come back from school with silly, unbelievable stories, and whenever I ask any of the other children, I find out it's all lies. I'm not going to make a fool of myself by complaining again. I don't think it's funny, even if you do." "It's not meant to be funny," Lloyd glared at Dinah. "She knows that. She's a filthy, foul traitor. She's the one who's telling lies, and—" "That's enough!" Mrs. Hunter banged her hand on the table. "I don't blame Dinah for not wanting to join in with your silly games. You've been unpleasant to her ever since she came. I won't have it. This is her home now as well as yours, and you'll just have to get used to it. But not another word." "It doesn't matter, Elle," Harvey said miserably. "We ought to have known it would be like this. It's always like this. 200 people to say we're lying, Whatever we say, we can't do anything about it. We can refuse to speak to traitors, Lloyd said hotly. Come on, H, let's go to the playroom. There's a bad smell in this kitchen. He stamped out. Harvey stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Dinah. How could you, he said reproachfully, when you know what it was like? Weirder and weirder, Year 5. Okay, see you tomorrow for the prefects meeting.